Welcome back, everybody. Politics at Work. After Christmas and all the holidays, we are back, and we're very happy to have Attorney Ken Wood back with us. And today we are going to talk about still around bail and that system, but specifically, I think we wanted to focus on public funding of bailouts. Am I correct, Ken?
Public funding of bails, or I guess charitable bail. How they're doing, or whether they're even performing the function that they were created for.
Yeah, and you had some good stories out there that I think would be a good starting point to talk about why this is an important topic to discuss. Do you want to share a couple of those situations where it was a problem?
Well, I think we've had multiple examples now of people who were out on, substantial crimes, and then they were bonded out by charitable bail organizations, and then they committed additional crimes. I think we've had multiple examples. Mr. Lang.
When you say internal bail organizations, who are you referring to?
Oh, charitable bail funds, like
charitable bail funds. Okay.
Project and others like that. The history of them is they just kind of grew up. Most of them are the big money, and since the protests, I guess is one way of saying it, from the summer of 2020, the vice president tweeted out that contributions were needed because we're going to need to bail out all these protesters, and 99% of them were released without bond and were never charged with a crime. And we can argue about whether that was proper or not, but I mean, as a result, tens of millions of dollars at the very least was raised, and so now we have these funds that have millions and millions of dollars that have a solution, but they're looking for a problem. And, they're finding, just everybody else, just, once you get past the rhetoric, the rhetoric is, we've got people languishing in jail that are first-time offenders. They just can't afford bond. Well, I think these examples all show those aren't the people in jail. I mean, especially during COVID, where the jails are overcrowded. They want to release as many people as they can. So first-time offenders are not in jail. I would argue they haven't been in years. People who, say they have a job and can't afford bail, those aren't the people in jail. The Harris County District Attorney just recently said their jail's full, and they're full of very dangerous people because the courts haven't been open for a year, and those people need to stay in jail. And so as a result, that's, I believe, the reason why you see these bail funds start getting this bad press, because they're bonding out the people that are left, just like the private industry is bonding out the people that are left. And those are people who have substantial criminal histories and are in trouble with the law.
So these charitable bail bond organizations that you talk about, you mentioned that they specifically sprung up or gained traction specifically associated with the recent protests. And I'm assuming this is associated with George Floyd and the other things that have happened. Now, have these charitable bond associations or organizations, have they been around since the original civil rights in the 60s and 70s?
No, I don't believe so. The oldest one is in New York, but New York has really heavily regulated bail funds for a long time. The rest of the states don't regulate these, so these are just kind of unregulated groups that have just come into a ton of money in the last year or two. So even though they may have been around for a long time or for a while, they've just now started having substantial resources. And since they weren't needed for the purpose they were donated to them, they didn't return the money. And so they're just looking for what to do, for things to do. And I think they're making poor decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point there, Ken, because we did see a spike of that public or charitable funds for bail, because I remember seeing people, especially around the protests last year, hey, this person got arrested for protesting, let's raise money, try to get them out. Do we know what percentage of those charitable bonds are being used for people who go back and commit crimes? Or do we just know the stories that for example, you gave us, and then some others around there?
No, these are unregulated entities in the majority of states. Texas has just passed a law requiring transparency that doesn't go into effect until I think next week. So, they don't disclose anything. It's just, the reason why the stories that we're finding out in the news is because of the bad press and people calling for them to stop doing what they're doing. And so because they're unregulated, they're opaque, you don't know what they're doing until things start going amiss.
Mm-hmm.
But here, here's the part of the problem. I mean, these groups have on the news saying, look, we interview them and we think they should all be treated the same. I think that it kind of shows the whole problem. They're limited on what they can ask. They don't have the ability to search for information. They don't have the training to search for information. They don't have 200 years of experience like the bail industry does. And so they're doing an interview, and based on that, they're deciding whether to post a cash bond for these people. And so if they don't disclose, or if they decide to intentionally mislead them and give them a sob story, then they're getting out of jail. And I think the majority of the time where these criminals or where these people are going on to commit additional crimes, they never knew. They didn't know their criminal history. They don't look at criminal history.
Well, I think it probably also has to do with the fact that not only, is it a sob story coming from the particular person that's incarcerated, but, if the other person has family members on the outside that can contact these charitable organizations, I think that would definitely work in that inmate's favor to getting bond from this particular charitable organization. And again, if you're correct, if they're not doing any research into any criminal history, all they're taking on is character witnesses of this particular inmate's family who might be contacting them, asking them to help get this person out, who's obviously only going to focus on the good things this person has done and are going to omit the bad things. And then, of course, there's the old saying, prison is made up of 99% innocent people. It's not correct, but it's a statement on the fact that the majority of incarcerated people say that they did not commit the crime. When you interview the inmate, they're gonna present them being unjustly incarcerated, which happens now, with the majority of people who are incarcerated. So I can see your point from that. I don't necessarily think that charitable organizations bailing people out of jail is overall a bad thing, because as we talked about before, you say first-time offenders are not the people who are in jail, but I think that because a cash bond system exists and because there is inequality with ability to pay, and we discussed that previously, I think that charities that can work and help underprivileged people who are looking at a minor crime and who can't afford to be bailed out of jail can turn to these particular charities for help. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. However, your concerns are valid. How in depth are these charitable organizations looking into this particular inmate's past? Are they doing a risk assessment on this inmate? Or are they just going off the pleas of their family members and friends in an interview that they did with the inmate? Which, again, I don't agree with you is due diligence when thinking about what's necessary to make that decision whether or not they should post bail or not.
Well, and let me just, make a point here about, bail funds in general, and how I think that falls squarely into the problem that we see bad bail reform across the country in our urban areas. And that is that we have people that have good intentions, I would say maybe, but they're setting up systems that are for failure because they're looking at one set of facts and they're saying, hey, poor people should not be in jail. First-time offenders shouldn't lose their job. We all agree with that. But then they set up systems that can be where they tie the hands of the judges, and then who's taking advantage of that? Career criminals, organized crime. Same thing is true. I think the same arguments are absolutely true when you see the substantial growth of charitable bail funds. I mean, we're saying, well, we need to regulate them. I mean, at the very least, we need to have transparency. But if we don't, we've now highlighted that, hey, some groups can raise large sums of money and put it in a fund that's opaque, that nobody can see into, nobody can see how it was raised. And we can get people released on cash bonds across the country. And we know from the bail industry history, because it has a colorful history, that those can be misused and be done in a way where people can organize crime again. Career criminals can take advantage of that and take advantage of the criminal justice system. So at the very least, we need regulation. We need regulation so that these things that have popped up to substantial use in the last year, that we can have transparency. And just like all the other bad bail reform, We don't set up a system that allows career criminals, organized crime, gang members to take advantage of the criminal justice system like we're seeing across the country.
I think that makes sense. I would say that makes sense to have some regulation around that. If we're not getting rid of the bail system and it's something that's in place, these charitable organizations, as Jonathan mentioned, help maybe close the gap between people who can afford bail and people who can't. So it gives them that opportunity. But
let's don't talk about the abstract. Let's talk about specifics. Do you want charitable bail organizations or bailing out people who have substantial criminal history, who have 5 arrests, 2 convictions in the last 3 years? Do you want
no, not at all. No.
I mean,
and that's where I think that regulation that you mentioned makes total sense.
well, so you've seen some regulation about, I think it was proposed in Texas, but it didn't pass, that they be limited to misdemeanors, and people who are people who are claiming that poverty are limited to poor people and only misdemeanors. That did not pass. They can post any charitable, any cash bond they want in Texas as long as they disclose it and they start filing reports. But that doesn't go into effect until probably January the 1st. So in just a couple of days.
That sounds like a reasonable thing to have.
I think it's reasonable, but you've got problems like, if you look at the Darrell Brooks, the guy from the Christmas parade, there was a Bell Project. I think the Bell Project or another charitable bail organization started a GoFundMe to try to raise the cash to post his cash bond. In what universe would any bail fund think it was appropriate to raise money for that, to post a cash bond for that individual? I don't think that would ever be appropriate. And the only reason why it wasn't done is GoFundMe pulled down the fundraiser page.
So let me ask you this, Ken, and this is just a question about how the bail bonds, I guess, industry operates, because I'm not in that industry, so I don't know. So let's say somebody who has a violent history, right? Let's say, they have had previous arrests for whatever the case may be, a consistent drug arrest or maybe a weapon possession, something that gives you the idea from looking at a crime portfolio that this person obviously doesn't have their act together. But they obviously commit not just misdemeanors, some misdemeanors and some felonies, and they're consistent with bad behavior. So let's say they get arrested for a possession charge, but they have a history of negative. And let's say this particular possession charge is a misdemeanor, but they've been arrested previous times for felony issues. So they're facing a bond of, and I'm just going to use a number, it may be wrong, please don't crucify me on this, because I don't know what this usually does, but let's say the judge puts a bond for, I don't know, $80,000 on this particular person. So if their friend of family members goes to a bail bondsman, okay, and they say, I want to bond so-and-so out of jail. We have whatever, the 10% down, 8K or whatever it is. That bail bondsman, what process does he go through in determining whether or not he's going to issue a bond for that person?
Okay, I think that there's a substantial process, and sometimes people even say, okay, don't talk about this because it's inside baseball. We're talking too much of our, trade secret type stuff. And I don't think any of this is top secret. And this just makes, a lot of it's just common sense. We look at some major things. How long has the family been in the community? How much family does he have in the community? Does he have family that he's close to that are outside the community? What's his last name? What's the chances of the likelihood of leaving the country down south? Does he speak a foreign language that would assist him in that? Things like, does he have a car? She have a car? That's important for getting to court. If you don't have a car, your risk of failing to appear is going to go up. Do they have an attorney? If they don't have an attorney, what is their job history? Even if they're not working now, what's their job history? Are they stable? Are they not stable? Then we start talking to the family members, because I think the better family network they have, the less likely they are to run. Also getting family involved. And then I think that also makes it an impression on the defendant that this is important, that they need to come to court, not just for them, but for their entire family. And then I think we monitor them, we supervise them. The more risky it is, then If it's a risky bond, then they have to come in person every week to our office and sign in saying that they're reporting. Or if it's not, if it's, we don't think the bond is as risky, then we would allow them to call in weekly to report to us. Sometimes bondsmen use an app so that they have to check in with the app, and the app gives them a snapshot of where they are digitally with GPS, so we can see every week when they're reporting where they're located, which would be helpful if there was a failure to appear. But I think most importantly, is we build a relationship with the defendant. We all make mistakes. That's what they've done to get where they are. But we also make mistakes sometimes in failing to show up for court. And if we have a relationship with the defendant, we can get that case back on track very quickly, because we can say, hey, you failed to appear. This is what will happen. So we can get your case back on track. We will go with you to court. We'll get your case reset. Or this is, this is what likely will happen. And so I think building that relationship allows us to get them back to court as quickly as possible and get the case back on track.
So what's interesting is you didn't mention in any of that the review of their criminal history.
But we do that. I mean, we have, yes, and that is one of the things we would look at, because we will have the ability to see that. Now, in Texas does not have a statewide database for people to look at readily, and the Texas just ordered or required that to be set up so that criminal histories can be reviewed statewide, and that has to go into effect April 1st. But we do ask questions, and questions would be asked about their criminal history, and then we would also investigate their criminal history as much as we can online, and we have more resources and ability to do that.
So the reason why I brought this up is one of the concerns that you had mentioned when you were talking about the charitable organizations jumping in and handling this bail system instead of a bail bondsman, was the lack of vetting that they were doing on these inmates that you.
They don't know. They don't have the experience. They don't know how to supervise. They don't know how to get people to court. I mean, posting a cash bond, technically the bond is not, it's not them that's the surety, it's the cash. But when you post a cash bond, you have to keep up with all your court dates. You have to keep up with all this. And these charitable bail funds don't even know what all that system is. They're out of their league.
Sure. And I understand what you're saying, right? The charitable organizations do not have the experience that a bail bondsman does, and the knowledge of how to operate in that AO, what I call AO, area of operation, right?
Yeah.
Because they might have a lawyer on staff, but I promise you they don't have a bail bondsman on staff. So yeah, I agree with you. But what I'm trying to get at is are there going to be instances where somebody comes to them, right? A family comes to them, or a friend trying to bail out somebody from jail, and based on their criminal history alone, based on the amount of times that they've been in jail and what they've been in jail for, so I know it could be a mixture of both, the bail bondsman will say, no, I'm not going to bail this person out because I don't believe they should be on the street. And is there a industry line that everyone stays under? Or can that person be like, okay, I'm going to take my money down the road to another bail bondsman, and he may be willing to bail this person out and not worry about their criminal history, whereas bail bondsman will say, no, I won't touch this person because of their history. Does that happen?
Absolutely. I've talked to some bondsmen just recently, I think on a different podcast, and asked that very question. And there's some certain crimes that bondsmen will not post bonds for, like capital murder in Texas. If you're accused of capital murder, the court can deny bail. But if they set, a lot of bondsmen will still refuse to post that bond. I think crimes against children is another crime that a lot of bondsmen would refuse to post bonds for. Historically, probably 10 years ago, it would be more likely that the defendant would commit suicide if they were found guilty of that. But now, I don't know what's changed, but they're much more likely to run today than to kill themselves or harm themselves. So I think those are becoming bonds that are toxic. And then on just between bondsmen, absolutely. You're going to have some bondsmen that are going to be very aggressive in their business and in their willingness to accept risk. And you're going to have other bondsmen that are going to be more conservative. I like to say, where's the line for you? It's going to be what's going to keep you up at night. And if you're writing this bond is going to keep you up at night, then maybe you shouldn't write it. And so there's going to be a wide spectrum of what different bondsmen would be willing to write, what risk they would be willing to take on.
So at the end of the day, right? We talked about the concern. We all agreed that the lack of regulation with these charitable organizations handling bonding these people out of jail is bad. That they don't know the history, and some of these could be lifetime offenders and whatnot. But at the end of the day, if a cash bond is set, right, even if it's for capital murder, like you mentioned, then they legally can be bonded out of jail. And if that particular charitable organization wasn't willing to bond that person out, then hypothetically, as long as the cash could be brought together, they could probably find a bail bondsman to get this person out of jail. Now, the difference between them being able to get out of jail and not get out of jail might be that charitable organization. They may not have the funds. The bail might be set super high because they do have criminal history. It might be $100,000 plus or something like that. And they may not, there's no way they can come up with a $10,000, 10% down payment or whatever the case, or whatever a bondsman may ask for to secure that bond. But at the end of the day, what is the big concern is not, the criminal history, because, you're probably going to be able to find a bondsman who's willing to take that risk on that person. The issue is the experience that the bail bondsman has in reviewing the risk, not only the criminal history, but the family ties, the risk to run, the ability to get to court, the check-in methods that they have to use with the app you mentioned and everything else, whereas the charitable organizations, they simply don't have those regulations in place or those abilities in place. Now, do we know, or do you know, the percentage of return to court on, or showing up to court on those bail bonds secured by the charitable organizations versus the return to court percentage on the ones secured by bail bonds? Do you know the difference in those two?
No, the data is not there yet because the rise of the use of charitable bail is too recent. But historically, the private industry has the best appearance rate by, I would say 50%. Well, you can say it different ways. I would say everyone else is 100% higher failure to appear rate than what we are. And so if we're at less than a 10% failure to appear rate, they would be, I think, like in in Harris County right now, the failure to appear rate on PR bonds is 50% or more. And so cash bonds would be somewhere between those. And the reason why is there's a more incentive for people to show up for court because usually a family member has put up cash for them to get out of jail. But the problem is you still, whether it's a PR bond or it's a cash bond, you have the same problem. Nobody's reminding them to go to court, and no one's checking up on them, following up on them. And so they get scared, they get mad, or they just don't, or they commit another crime. And so they just don't go to court. Like Harris County is really funny right now because they think, oh, we'll just send everybody a text reminder about court, and we won't need the private industry anymore. If it was that easy, we would just be sending text messages. That these are nomads. That's the reason why they're in trouble. They lose cell phones, or they don't have a cell phone, and if you give them one, they're going to lose it within a couple of months because that's who they are. That's the reason why they got in this situation. They've already been failed so many times, by families, by schools, by opportunities to work, by drugs. And so now we're just saying, oh, well, the criminal justice system is just going to give them a pass too. Well, that means they're going to pass their whole life as every opportunity to correct them or make them productive citizens has failed them. And at some point we have to say public safety needs to be more important, more paramount than all of these look the other way. We feel sorry for them. And that's really where we are. Crime has increased so much, and you can say, oh, there's other factors other than these bad bail reform issues, but you've got courts haven't tried cases for a year. You've got defendants who should have had their cases resolved and already sent to jail. You've got states that are not wanting to build more jails. You've got people arguing, well, we've got more people in jail than any other country. Well, we've have a higher drug problem than anywhere in the country, in the world too. That's where all the drugs go. We've got, we are where all the drugs go. And people say, well, we've lost the war on drugs. If we give up on the war on drugs, almost 90% of all the crimes are related to drug use. And who is the one taking advantage of it when we say, we're not going to prosecute those crimes anymore. It's organized crime, it's gangs, it's career criminals. And so we're using arguments that no one wants to disagree with, but we're setting up a system that ties the hands of the criminal justice system to allow career criminals, gangs, organized crime just take advantage and rape and pillage the criminal justice system. And the bail funds, which we're talking about today, is just another example of setting up well-intended things. And I would even say here, these weren't set up. There's just money arrived overnight because of protests. And there was this demand that we're going to need this, and it was never needed. And so now we're seeing the rise of these things, and it's the same situation. It's all well-intended, but it's going to be misused. And who's going to be the first people to take advantage of it? Career criminals, organized crime, gangs. And nobody wants to talk about that.
So I want to touch base, really a follow-up question. So does the bail bonds industry look at these charitable bond organizations, the long-term industry threat, or is it one of those things that, you know, it popped up overnight, as you mentioned, it may go away overnight if we don't continually have things like protests and riots and things along those lines? Is it something that is taking a huge chunk percentage out of the bail bonds industry right now, or is there any concern in the industry, or is just something like, oh, that's not good, but it won't last?
Well, I think in the short, I think that you're correct. I think this is a short-term issue because it arose overnight, has a lot of money. We've already seen some allegations of misuse of funds. And so I think that with rising crime that you're going to see, it'll be more and more difficult for these funds to raise money in the future. I don't even know if they're asking for additional funds, except for the example of the Christmas parade where they tried to do a GoFundMe page. So I think that it's a short-term issue, but it's not in the best interest of the criminal justice system to have these things unregulated. If we're going to have them, they need to be regulated. And I think that's probably the biggest point that I'm making. Because we don't want to set up systems that can be taken advantage of so that the criminal justice system is worse than better. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, all of these, if the best you can say is well-intended changes that have been made across the urban areas have tied the hands of judges, and the people that are taking advantage of the system are career criminals, gangs, and organized crime. You can see that through simple release and tried in New York, tried in Harris County, where certain crimes, they could not be set a bond, they had to be released without a bond. And so you got people who've been arrested 10, 12. There was one guy who was in the news in New York who'd been arrested 80 times. And he was saying, bail reform's great, love it. Well, of course he would, because he can't be kept in jail. He just gets to keep taking advantage of people. And at some point, you know, we're going through exactly what happened in the 60s. We had a wave of criminal justice reform. People passed it. We had rising crime, and that's what brought us a tough-minded system that everyone is critical of now. If people do not wake up, then we're going to have the exact same thing happen again. Crime is already increasing. I don't think there's any dispute on that. And the question is, what do we do about it? Well, if Democrats or if the two parties do not work together on this, then one party will get their way through the election box, and the other party may not like what ultimately happens. And I think that this is really a call to action for both parties. You need to work together. Maybe the one side that wants a whole bunch needs to settle for a little, but the other side that doesn't want to give anything needs to give in, or we're going to have, I think one party's set up right now for a massacre in the next election. And I think criminal justice, our rising crime and bad criminal justice reform, bad bail reform that's happened over the last 2 or 3 years is going to have a huge impact at the election box next year. And so, you know, I'm just kind of telling everybody they need to, you know, if they're worried about it, they need to work towards something in the middle, and nobody's doing that.
So touching back on what you were talking about, specifically with the GoFundMe's, I mean, I see, you know, where it would be fairly easy, not easy, but there would be a clear roadmap of how to set regulations when it comes to these organized charitable organizations that are doing the bond. That makes a lot more sense. I find it extremely difficult to regulate people who are, doing GoFundMe's to try to get money to go bail out whoever, their cousin, son, whatever the case may be. Just while we were sitting here, I pulled up GoFundMe and I searched bail and bond, and there's over 10,000 results. And there's probably more that I just didn't search the right keyword for, of people who are raising money to bail whoever the case may be, out of jail. And not all of these are protest related. Some of them is, whatever, the stories differ all the way from protesting to, petty crime to whatever the case may be. He's a father of 3. I need him out of jail so he can work and provide for the family, things along those lines. It would be really, really difficult to cut down on that crowdfunding type of process. And a lot of these have raised a good amount of money for that. That's almost the same as, going door to door in a neighborhood and saying, hey, my husband got arrested. Can you give me $10 to help get him out of jail? Are you going to tell people that they also can't do that? That's similar to saying, hey, you can't do a GoFundMe account. Regulation from the charitable organizations is one thing. I completely agree with you on that. I just find it very, very difficult to stop people from crowdfunding on the internet towards getting their loved one out of jail. And, if you're going to stop them from crowdfunding on the internet to get people out of jail, in my opinion, from a liberty standpoint, I think it's a slippery slope to saying, well, if I can't ask for money online, are you also going to stop me from asking money in person? Can the community not come together and do a fundraising event for me to help get Joe Blow out of jail? So, it's these, in my opinion, I could be wrong, these probably have been going on for much longer than we're aware of. There probably been GoFundMe accounts online to get people out of jail since, crowdfunding became a thing on the internet. And before then, I'm sure there were community events where they raised money to get so-and-so out of jail. You look at motorcycle clubs, and I'm not trying to paint motorcycle clubs as bad. I know there's plenty of motorcycle clubs out there that do not do any sort of crime activity. But when you talk about organized crime, and I want to touch base on that real quick, when you talk about organized crime, almost every organized crime, whether it's a motorcycle club, whether it's, whatever it is, a gang or whatever, if they're really organized, they usually have a legal representative on staff, or they pay, and they usually have a bond fund, right, to get these people get their people out of jail whenever they get caught doing whatever illicit activity they're getting caught doing. That's also a form of that. It's not a charitable organization, mind you, but it is a fund that these organizations are using to pay bond whenever one of their particular individual of their organization gets arrested. So I find that to be a really difficult area to effectively regulate, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, that's kind of a good point. And the question is, what is it that I think there's a distinction between family members wanting to raise money to post a cash bond. And I think there's a distinction between a charitable organization wanting to raise cash for a specific person to post a cash bond. I think I make a distinction in my mind in those two situations. But I think where we are is trying to decide how we want to treat charitable bail funds that have really not existed with a lot of resources until the last year. And you've got different approaches that are out there. Texas just really didn't do any regulation. It did a requirement of transparency and disclosure and filing reports. I'm aware that I think Pennsylvania, there's a bill pending where they just want to make them a bondsman. That they're including the definition of a bondsman to be a charitable bail organization. And that may be where we end up if they become such organized groups. They just need to be bondsmen or regulated by the same rules. Texas has Texas has substantial regulations that govern bondsmen. And it would be very difficult for charitable bail organizations to comply with those, even though they complained at the legislature that there's just not, we're making them have to do stuff the bondsman don't do. The bondsman does 10 times what they ever would be requested to do. And so I think we're at a point where we're trying to decide as a society, what do we want to allow charitable bail funds to do? And I think that's a good debate going forward. I think we may end up that we feel like they need to be regulated. And the question is, how heavily regulated? Do we want to just make them disclosed? Do we want to limit them to posting a certain types of bonds, misdemeanor for first-time offenders? Or do we want to just say, hey, you can post anything, but you're going to be a bondsman, you're going to have to comply with those rules? I don't think that they're going to be around long enough to really worry about that. I think they'll fizzle out because they don't really have the knowledge. And as someone fails to appear, and if the laws vary from state to state, then those cash bonds will be forfeited and turned over to the state. And I think that's once that happens a lot in a couple of years, then they're not going to have as much money to post. And so it may be a problem that takes care of itself over the next year or so. But I don't know. I think we're yet to see where this will head.
Here's what I think. Number one, I agree with you, Ken. There should be some regulation for those charitable organizations. But number two is, how often does it really happen where a charitable organization posts bail for somebody that's going to go out and do something horrible? I would be surprised if it's more than 1% of the time. And I would also say, I bet it also happened with bondsmen out there and bail companies where just from noise and bias and those two things, you can give the same case to 10 or 15 different bondsmen. They're not going to do it the same way, and they're not going to make the same decisions, even if it's the exact same case and the exact same person. Somebody will make a mistake where they will post bail for someone that comes back and commits a horrible crime. So even then, I just don't know that it's going to get rid of the problem. And lastly, the bail system or the charitable companies that are trying to help people out there, I really don't see them as the main source of the problem for crime increasing. I think it goes back to what you were saying around politics and where Democrats and Republicans are going. If we keep going the way Democrats are handling things, the way Republicans handle things, the US is going to be just like Brazil within the next 5 years from both a crime standpoint and an economic standpoint. So that's where the changes need to happen. I don't see any data from what I've researched that tells me that bail reform or the charitable bails is what's causing the increase in crime.
Well, I would disagree about bad bail reform not causing crime to increase, because I do believe that. And that's because these areas that have enacted these rules that are tying the hands of the judges, you've got people who fail to appear for court. Now, historically, if you don't show up for court, either your bond goes up substantially or you just get held. That's the punishment for not coming to court. You get held in jail until your case is resolved. If you're in jail, then you can't commit more crime. And we're telling people, well, we're not going to hold you accountable anymore. We're going to allow you to miss court. Like Harris County, they allow you to miss court at least 3 times for misdemeanors before they can do anything to you now. And so they can commit, I mean, let's be brazen. You could say, well, they commit 3 more crimes before they'll ever do anything on the first case, if they're ever going to do anything. So I think the lack of accountability that we've set up through the bad bail reform we've seen across the country in the urban areas, I think that has substantially increased crime. And I go back to, I think I've mentioned this before, the underlying problem in our urban areas that no one seems to be able to figure out the answer to is, how do we process large numbers of people through the jail quickly and efficiently? They don't want to spend the money to do individual magistration. So right now we're experimenting with just simple release. Simple release has been a complete failure, whether it's in New York, where if you're charged with certain crimes, you have to be released on 0 bond, or like in Harris County, if you're not charged with a list of specific misdemeanors, everything else you're released on a $100 PR bond, and you never see a magistrate. So nobody's looking at your criminal history to see if you've been arrested 10 times, 30 times, 5 times before. It's a $100 PR bond and you get out. You get out before they're even through with the paperwork. And those are that's not worked anywhere. And so that's what we're currently experimenting with in our urban areas as the alternative to what we've done historically. And those are not working, but nobody has a proposal for what to replace it with that just doesn't kill the county with cost, like the cost of individual administration. And that's the problem. It continues to be the problem. And until we figure that out, all these other issues, we can talk about charitable bail organizations bailing a few people out, and some of them come back and commit other crimes. But the biggest issue is how in our urban areas do we process large numbers of people to jail? And until we figure out how to do that, do it in a way that has accountability and allows the county to use the limited resources they currently have to process the people quickly and efficiently, and do it in a way that just doesn't create chaos, we're just going to continue to have substantial problems and increasing crime.
Yeah. Or even better, even a step beyond that, instead of processing people faster through the system, how do we prevent those people from even committing crime in the first place? What other countries in the world doing to prevent the high crime rates that we see here? And then we can get to the bail system, which I think it's only the US and the Philippines that use monetary bail system in the world now, at least the way that we have it. Everywhere else in the world is different. So what's working there that can be replicated from a bail perspective? But most important, how do we prevent those crimes from even happening? Where do we need to invest money? Because it may be a way lower investment if we try to tackle this up front versus where we are now, where we're just trying to catch up with all the crime that's happening.
The problem we've got now is, we've kind of given up on a lot of crime. We keep hearing, well, the war on crime failed. Well, okay, we're going to concentrate on treatment, but you can't make somebody go to treatment unless you can't make them if they don't agree to it. And so you find, like in our urban areas and a lot of our counties, that certain crimes, they just don't prosecute anymore. Even though it's still a crime, they just don't prosecute anymore. And when you have that mentality, well, I can do this as a green light, I can do this. And if you give up on, we've got people arguing we should just decriminalize all drugs. And who does that benefit if you think about it? Who's going to take advantage of that? Well, it's going to be, the people making money off of it. And then it's not going to be a crime, but you still have the people who are stealing because they don't have any money to go buy it, no matter what the cost. Let's say we deregulate it or we don't make it a crime anymore, so it costs less. They still don't have the money to buy it because we have all these other issues. We're spending a ton of money on education, but urban schools are still failing their kids. They have high dropout rates. We have, because of the protests from the summer, we have businesses that have closed that will not come back. So there's less business opportunity in our urban areas. Families are failing in our urban areas. The lack of fathers staying at home. You've got just already a huge amount of drug use and overdoses in our urban areas. And so we have already failed, and we have thrown money at that. And now we're saying, well, we've lost the war on drugs. And so it looks like to me we're just giving up because we've thrown a ton of money at these other things and it hadn't gotten better. And so now we don't want to throw money at jails anymore. So we're giving up on that too. So and I'm not going to say all of it, but there is a part of what is going on is as a result of this mentality that we shouldn't prosecute certain people anymore. And the people, the career criminals, the organized crime, the gangs are seeing that as for what it is. Green light, field day, let's go make money.
You made a very good point there, Ken. I want to touch base on real quick. Sorry, Paco. I'll hand it back over to you because I know this is your discourse. This will be quick. You made a really good point. When we talk about the breakdown of the nuclear family and how that's impacted crime rates, drug addiction, mental health, all of that stuff. There's an interesting statistic that I've used in previous podcasts when we talk about the single motherhood rate in the African American community. I know this does not just impact the African American community. Unfortunately, that's the only stat that I have. But back in the 1960s, single motherhood rate was 18%. It was 18% in the 1960s in the African American community. It is close to 80% now in the African American community. Now, and I always ask this question because it's important. It's a tough one to answer. It's a tough pill to swallow. Are we racist more now in this country than we were in the 1960s and the 1970s when all the great legislation was made to equalize our country? Now, granted, that did not cure racism on an individual basis. That still exists to this day. But when you look at the breakdown of the nuclear family, not having a father in the home is one main one. The amount of single parent homes, because mothers are equally important. Okay. When we talk about fatherless households, because that's what we have the majority in this country, there's also father only households that struggle. It's super difficult to raise a child without having the support structure around them of the mother and the father. And you can look, and Jordan Peterson talks about it many times, kids coming from homes with single parents, whether it's a single mother or a single father, are far more likely, I believe it's 23%, more likely to drop out of school, 32 or 33% more likely to take part in destructive behavior, whether that's drugs, alcohol, self-harm, or whatever the other case may be. And it's tough. And there's no easy fix for that. But I'm glad you brought that up, because that is indeed a very impactful thing. And it not only impacts the number of people who are using drugs in our country, the crimes that they then commit, because you've mentioned, drug use leads to crime, poverty rates, education, all of that's impacted. So I wanted to touch base on that because that was a really important thing that you said, and it does truly impact. Sorry, Paco, go ahead.
Well, wait,
No, it's good.
let me
Go ahead,
add
Ken.
what you're saying is, it's even worse than you think, because, when we're talking about the drug culture, a lot of times they're not living with just mom, or they're living with grandma or grandma and grandpa. So if there is two, it's usually grandma and grandpa, and it may just be grandma. We have we have a girl that's at my high school. I mean, my high school where we live, that goes to school with my daughter, and she was living with her grandparents, and they both got COVID and died. She has no relationship with her parents. She didn't know who her dad was, and her mom had a long history of drug use, and her relatives were all siblings of her grandma. And she's 16 she ended up asking a teacher if she could finish high school living with that family, because she didn't trust anyone else in her family. That's where we are. And that's, just imagine, if you're living with one grandparent, you don't have any support system. Really the importance is having a support system, whether it's a man and wife, just a support system, whatever it is. If you only have one person that's taking care of you and there's no other support, then that's going to have a devastating impact, or because everybody's stressed out all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you both bring very, very valid points. To your point, Jonathan, what has happened between the 60s and now, where that not just single parents, but also teenage pregnancies and earlier pregnancies in life, where it just makes it even more difficult. That has increased in the Black population. So, but what has happened is, look at how schools are funded in the US. They're funded based on zip codes. And we know that there's a lot of segregation based on zip codes. So they're not receiving the same quality education in communities that have more Black people. So think of how other countries in the world fund their schools, right? They do it more at a state level instead of a zip code level. Doing it at a zip code level is almost unheard of everywhere else. That allows the school system and the education system to be better and more balanced for everyone, rather than hey, if you live in a poor zip code, you're going to get crappy education, and then you end up having people that get in trouble, that get pregnant earlier in life, etc. Because we know, and there's plenty of studies, right, that say education is the key to lower the amount of teenage pregnancies and to lower the amount of divorce, etc., later on in life. So I think that could be a really good solution. Think of how we fund schools and how we make education higher quality for everyone, rather than just based on where you live is the education that you get. I think that would improve mobility. It would certainly reduce crime, and we may even, and this is just based on other countries, we may even end up spending less money per student if we did that differently. So I would say that's a really good option.
I think the schools is a bigger problem than any of us think, because I think that there is structural problems that prevent things from being fixed. I think some of those have been exposed during COVID, where decisions for closing schools or opening schools were being made by teachers' unions, and irrespective of whether it was good or bad for the students, they were arguing for certain things, and they were making demands, and they were refusing to go back to school no matter what until certain demands were met. And I think that's endemic of a bigger issue and a bigger problem that we have with public schools. I don't think in our urban areas that there's any amount of money that can fix a failing school right now, because I think that there's structural things in place that protect it. And that may be, that may be hard to hear, but I think that we are past the point on some of our school systems, and unless somebody wants to come in and create enemies left and right, and then they're going to be run off. I think they're set up for failure now, and no one's going to even be willing to say, hey, we're just going to give everybody a grant. Here, you're going to get this amount of money, and you decide where you want to take your kid to school. You would have private schools pop up everywhere. But that's not even palatable. The politics of that would never work. And so I don't think the fix for schools is just spending more money for failing schools. I think they're set up for failure in some areas. And I think that's a really big problem. And I think there's been money thrown at them and they've not fixed it. You can look at the school's dropout rate. Texas has done a lot for testing, and now they're being criticized on it because we don't want to hold people accountable. Same thing, almost any school. If the school's failing, we want to look for a reason why to say that that's not valid, instead of saying, what do we need to do to improve? Because sometimes it requires tough decisions. My family were all educators. I taught school for several years before I went to law school. And there's just some kids that are just, they're just mean. They're just bad. And if they aren't willing to comply with the rules, then they don't need to be in the school. If we set up a system where we cannot keep the bad kids from going, it's almost a smaller example, but of the bigger problem that we're having in the criminal justice system. We're tying the hands of the schools so that they can't hold people accountable. And who's taking advantage of it? The mean kids, the bullies, the ones that are saying, hey, there's nothing you can do to me. So, I think the schools are a little bit of a little light, showing us that we've already failed and we're following the same recipe for criminal justice reform, bail reform, that we've already done for schools, and it didn't work.
Yeah, I agree with you. The education system is very broken, and it's beyond money. I'm just talking about funding differently as a good starting step, but it's very broken. I agree with you, Ken, on that. I think we're at the top of the hour, but is there anything else that you want to add to this, Jonathan, Ken?
No, I'm good. I again appreciate your time and coming back, Ken. It's always an honor to have you on and hear your insights and knowledge. So I appreciate it.
Well, first, thank you for having me. And I would just say, we're going into an election cycle. Texas, our primary is in March. And I think, we're going to be electing a new House in November of next year. And everyone's expecting big changes. I think that just like past elections, we reward the party that's not in power, and we punish the party that's in power for failure, whether it's their fault or not. And I think we're going into a cycle where maybe the people in power maybe should be punished, because we've seen all these bad reforms that have been tried for the last couple of years. And I think that the roosters or the chickens are going to come home to roost, and they need to, because the pendulum has swung too far, and we're now seeing it starting to swing the opposite direction. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Ken. And they're going to get slaughtered. Democrats are going to get slaughtered next year, and they've done it to themselves. So
I agree. I think they have, and they've allowed but you know what? The extreme part of the party will say that the reason why they got slaughtered is because they didn't go far enough extreme. And so until both parties learn that leading from the extremes is a recipe for disaster, we're going to see for the next several election cycles, the party that wins spends the first year undoing as much of the stuff the other party did for the first year. We've never seen that before, but Trump and Biden are the first two presidents we've had where they spent their first year trying to undo everything their predecessor did, instead of building upon what worked. And as long as we have that, and we're going to continue to have it for a while, we're not going in the right direction, and we need to change course.
see, I don't know that Biden hasn't done anything that Trump did.
Yeah,
He's pretty
I
much on course
was
with
about
the
to
same.
say.
Biden's done a lot to undo what Trump did, and he tried, and some of what he's tried to undo, the courts have told him he can't undo. Trump did a lot trying to undo what Obama did. And
Sure, I agree with you on that one.
That did happen.
Yeah, I'm just saying Biden, one thing he said that we've talked about previously is he came out and said, don't worry, nothing's going to change, right? When I become president, nothing's going to change. And, he did initially come and, he signed that slew of, executive orders right after taking the oath of office. But he slowly, almost turned in some aspects to mirroring Trump's stance on a lot of things. And that could be pure laziness of not wanting to do anything, your reason alone that the court stopped him from doing certain things. But yeah, I think one thing Biden did say truthfully while he was on the campaign trail is, nothing will change, everything will remain the same. And that means bad and good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think even before the election, we called it, saying Biden is going to be just like Trump, because Biden is probably like a George Bush type president. So,
gosh, I don't see that. I see that Biden ran as a moderate, but he's really run. Now, maybe it's because his policies haven't passed, but he has run as a very extreme left president on the policy end. What he wants and what he's proposed are not anything like what he ran on. And so I mean, this Buildback Better, I think, is a far left. Now, maybe we're saying, hey, it hadn't passed, but I don't see that. I see him running. In fact, I see him being held hostage by the far left after he got elected, because they're the ones. I just feel like they're telling him, we can get rid of you anytime we want, so you have to do what we want.
I wish that was true, Ken, because I am very, very far left, and I wish that was true, but not even in the Build Back Better plan. There's very, very few things that would be considered left. People who were considered left, like AOC and Rashida Tlaib, they're praising Biden so much. They're very happy with the direction, but in reality, none of the policies, well, number one, he hasn't really passed anything meaningful. But then number two, what he's trying to pass, I mean, there's nothing that's truly left. I wish it was true.
Yeah, the cost
of left of center, sure, absolutely, left of center, but
there's nothing left of center.
Nothing truly left. And the Build Back Better plan, when you talk about that, when it was initially drafted, yes, it was. There were some things on there that were left, funding, specifically where money was going to go. And then once it went through the chopping block 3 or 4 or 5 times, what came out the other end was a very neutered,
it was still not nothing left.
Yeah, lukewarm nothing. And so I agree with Paco on that, on his point. No, the Build Back Better plan was initially had some left things on there, not far left, but some left things on there. But now that it's gone through the grindstone a couple times, it's just nothing in there is furthering a left agenda. And even some of the moderate Democrats have come out and stated that, you know, they're openly against the Build Back Better plan, openly against their party. And it's interesting to watch the members he mentioned. You talk about Ocasio-Cortez and you talk about Rashida Tlaib, you know, the far left's poster children, right? They're the ones who were elected on the far left principles, succumb to the pressure of their party. And even when their party openly, you know, disagreed with the spending bill and said, this is, you know, we shouldn't do this, which I agree with its current format. There's no reason we should be throwing money at any of the things that are in this Build Back Better plan. It's so neutered and dumb now. It doesn't matter. We desperately need infrastructure support in this country. We definitely need to rebuild better, quotation marks. But the funding and the way that bill is put out is not rebuilding better.
Corporate subsidies.
Yeah, very little of that percentage is actually going to go to infrastructure and things that this country desperately needs. Instead, it's going to the special interest groups and things that pad the pockets of politicians, and specifically the politicians in power, i.e. Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, who, if you look historically, have taken money from the same super PACs almost their entire time they've been in office. So neither of them, both the Speaker of the House, who's obviously the third most powerful person in government, and the most powerful person in government, are taking money from the same super PACs. That's where the subsidy money is going to go. And I know we're at the top of the hour and we're taking time away from you, Ken, and the rest of us. But, you know, if we continue to let out special interest groups lobbying to influence Washington and politicians, this is where money's going to go, because when they get that money and they get elected, they're expected to pay it back, whether it's in legislation or money or subsidies or whatever else the case may be. And you know, in my opinion, I believe that just it becomes so disgusting when that is allowed to happen. And actual positive change, whether conservative policies, which I support, or whatever other policies other people want out there, don't get done, because it'll cross and it will make those special interest groups angry, especially the the military funding. You know, I am for a very strong military. I support a very strong military. Now that we're not at war, quotation mark, you know, more money is going into that. And both Biden and Harris and Pelosi support the military industrial complex very heavily. So I'm not scared of Biden as a conservative. He doesn't have the cojones to do anything. And he doesn't, even in his own party, even in the old Democratic Party, it's fractured so much that he doesn't even, his own Build Back Better bill, the neutered Build Back Better bill that he neutered to appease the Republicans and to appease the Democrats, is being spoken out against on both sides. So he doesn't even have his own party behind him at this point. His own party is fractured. So that makes it incredibly difficult for him to get anything passed. And even Ocasio-Cortez will sit there with her lips pursed and act like she's super frustrated whenever, you know, that Democratic leader, forgot his name, but spoke out against the Build Back Better bill. But I was like, if you really were a far leftist like you claim to be, you'd be against it too, because as of right now, it doesn't have anything in there that you want. Mm-hmm. You're just posturing for posture's sake and doing it so people hopefully see you get mad, and they'll be like, oh yeah, she's upset about it too. But she's not upset about it for the reason that you think she's upset about it. And for the same reason, her march in the middle of the night to end the rent moratorium whenever nothing could actually be done mattered at all.
Wow, I'm shocked. I mean, I'm shocked. I would say I agree with some of that, but I disagree with a lot of it, because I think the Virginia election really showed you where the Democratic Party was on the, you know, they had two bills coupled together, and then they had just voted, the AOCs and her group refused to decouple them. And then the Virginia election happened. And then within 4 days or 3 days, or within days of the result of that election, suddenly those two bills, the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better, were no longer coupled. And AOC even came out saying that if her vote had been needed to pass the infrastructure bill, she would have voted for it. And so I think that there was a realization from the party at that point that next year is going to be so bad for them that they had to get what they could. And I think that's the whole problem, is I think they've been asking for the moon. They have a 50-50 Senate. They should have been shooting for whatever they could pass in the Senate and then passed it in the House and just building off of that. They would have had so many more wins and things to run on if they'd have run a moderate agenda. But where we are in our country right now, you cannot have a moderate agenda. And so I find it interesting that in my perspective, they ran the Buildback Better bill was written by Bernie Sanders. And you don't get any more left than Bernie. AOC's his.
You used to not get as left as Bernie. You used to not get as left as Bernie. Bernie before Biden is a completely different Bernie than Bernie is now. But yeah, I agree with you. He used to be the shining light.
I mean, the deal was done for him to support Biden, that he had to get this committee position. And he wrote a bill that could have never passed the Senate, never passed Manchin. Manchin was never going to support this. And they just, I don't know what they were thinking. So they just got caught up in their own little whatever to think that this is ever going to pass. And so you would, if you were really a true politician, you would say they wrote these bills to accommodate their base. And then when they fail, well, then they can say, well, we need more. Y'all need to get angry and you need to come out and vote for us. I think that was a miscalculation. This party is not a center left. It's not a left country. It's not a right country, but I do believe it's center right. And so I think that they've gotten arrogant. I think that what's fixing to happen, if Paco is right about next year, I think it's because they've overplayed their hand, not underplayed their hand. And saying that this bill needed to be more left, I think is crazy. I think the country couldn't take the bill where it is, let alone something even more extreme.
Well, you're correct, and I also think that the Democratic Party suffers from, what the Republican Party does to a certain extent, which is a lack of identity. Biden does not, he does not bring a identity to the Democratic Party. Harris does not bring an identity to the Democratic Party, and neither does Nancy Pelosi. They're a fractured party, and if you lack identity, not only are you correct in saying that they've been ineffective throughout, Biden's administration, they've been completely ineffective, and that will hurt them. But they also suffer from a lack of identity, and they're fractured inside of their own party. And when it's difficult to find things to run on and issues to take stances on when you're fractured even inside your own party, it's very, very difficult to get votes. But yeah, 110% agree that the Democrats have completely self-imploded on themselves during this administration. And I think both of you are correct. I agree with both of you that in the 2022 elections and in the presidential election, I think they're going to pay dearly for it.
Yep. Yeah, no, a very good point, Ken. I would almost also agree that they wrote the bill exactly how you said it, with the intention of not passing anything, so that next election say, hey, we couldn't pass it because we need more of your votes. They do that all the time. So I would not be surprised if that's why they wrote the bill that way. And also abortion, right? I think that's another piece that they have been trying to use to raise money and get more votes. If they wanted to, they could pass it. There have been many articles on many different ways that if they wanted to, they could pass this. Even with Manchin, they're throwing the fits that he's throwing. They have enough progressives in the House to pass whatever in the world that they want to, but they're not doing it. And it's likely because of what you mentioned. They're just trying to play to win the election and raise money.
Well, I think that's probably true in the House. I don't agree in the Senate. I don't think this is a Manchin, and I can't pronounce the other the woman's name from Arizona. I think her name is Simmons or Semino or
Sinema.
Sinema. Yeah. I don't think that the problems they have in the Senate are just limited to those two. I think there's other people that they also have issues with that are more than happy to be in the background and let them carry the water for their position. So everybody says the Senate's broken. I mean, the Senate is not broken. The Senate is built to pass a moderate agenda. We're just living in a time where if you propose a moderate agenda from either side of the aisle, you will have an opponent that's well-funded running against you in the next election. We have a system that's set up currently to be where we fund candidates from the extremes. And so until we figure out how to overcome that system. Like we see it in Texas all the time. A Democrat running for governor in Texas has to run to the far left to raise money. And they have to take those positions to raise money so they'll have the money to be competitive. But once they take those positions, they can't win in Texas because Texas is a conservative state. It's a conservative state when it was a Democrat state. It's a conservative state as a Republican state. In fact, right now, it's more conservative than it's ever been. The most recent legislative session was probably the most conservative we've had in many, many years. So Texas is conservative. The Democrats could win Texas, but there's no room in the Democrat Party for conservatives anymore. There's no room for the what's her name? What's her name that used to be the last Democratic governor of Texas. There's no room for them in the Texas Democrat Party anymore. And the last Democrat vice president from Texas, there's no room in the Democrat Party for him today. And so that's the reason why Texas is a Republican state.
See, I disagree a little bit there because all of the data told us that if, for example, Bernie would have been the Democratic nominee, he would have beaten Trump in Texas. And I'll talk about why. Think of the issues that we say are far left. I'll pick Medicare for all. They say it's far left, yet more than 80% of the country supports that. That includes Democrats and Republicans. If you grab an issue like that and you run it through the House and the Senate, yeah, you're going to have a lot of people that oppose it. But it's such a popular issue that you could really, really pressure the public to put pressure on their elected senators to either vote for it or you won't reelect them in the next election. But neither party does that. They just play to, let's just do the bare minimum and try to keep things the same. When it's stuff that our donors want, like military money, we pass that super easy, no issues, nobody asks questions, and the military gets raises every single year, right? They got like 20 or 30 extra $1 billion this year. Nobody asked questions. Nobody said, how are you going to fund this? We're not at war. Why do you need more money? Because they have the donors. But you get a popular issue, Medicare, infrastructure, legalizing marijuana, all of those issues, super popular with Democrats and Republicans. You can get that passed. You can get that passed in Texas because a lot of people support it when they understand the benefits that they would get from it. And the last time that we had a precedent that was passing truly leftist legislation is when they started to implement presidential terms, because that president kept getting reelected because people were getting those social programs that benefited them. We saw a lot of economic growth from that. So people did not want change back then.
I don't see the 60 votes in the Senate today for Medicare for all. And the reason why you don't have 60 votes in the Senate are for different reasons. And the biggest reason is just the cost. I mean, you have medical providers who don't want to do Medicare because they say what they get paid by Medicare is less than the cost of doing the procedure. And so you're telling us that if Medicare for all is very popular, well, first of all, it would be popular because we will charge you less because we're making doctors take less than it even costs to do a procedure in some situations. But even then, when you're paying, for Medicare for whatever portion of the population it is, people over 60, whatever, and you make it Medicare for all, that's suddenly the same thing as a guaranteed income. I mean, those are things that break the bank. And I know you've mentioned before about, well, we have a blank check when it comes to the military. We don't have a blank check on everything. Our debt has doubled in the last, few years over what it was. So, I mean, if we were to do Medicare for all and do this, forgive college, I keep coming back to this is we have to set priorities. And, if we don't set priorities, then, eventually there comes a time when the check is due. And I think Medicare for all is a tilt thing for our country. And it's not because it's a good idea. It's well intended, but the problem is it breaks the bank, just like other things. The guaranteed income breaks the bank. There's not enough money to be taken from the private industry if you took all their profits to pay for. And so not just raising taxes on the rich won't pay for that. There's no way to fund that. That's the reason why socialist countries ultimately fail, because they ultimately take all the profits and there's still not enough to fund the programs that they've set up. And so I don't think it should pass. I know I hear it's popular. It's not in the best interest fiscally for our country. And we can say, well, we need to cut back on military spending. I don't disagree with that, but the politics of that are the opposite. But I think Medicare for all is a tilt situation.
We need to have a whole episode on Medicare for all, Ken. Many studies show that Medicare for all would save money instead of spending more money, just because of you look at the next 10 years and how much money we're going to spend with the private healthcare industry. And I'm not talking doctors, I'm talking just the insurance providers, because
but we have studies that said, oh, if we enacted these bad bail reform things, it was going to make us safer. I mean, in California, they actually argue with a straight face. If we pass this law, which is going to change these felonies to misdemeanors, well, it'll make us safer. I mean, no one was saying, oh, yeah, but we're going to have DAs that are going to say we're no longer going to prosecute these crimes. And so now we're going to just see these as a green light for smash and grab crimes all over the place in California. And so I just look at, anytime you tell me there's a study that says all the money we're going to save. How many times have we heard proposals from politicians that say we're going to fund this through the savings by getting rid of Medicare fraud? Well, we've never saved any money from getting rid of Medicare fraud. We're never going to, that's a myth. And so when we say, oh, there's this study that says we're going to save all this money, look at all this money we spend. Yeah, and you're talking about tripling that when we do Medicare for all. And you're saying, well, we're going to take the money that we would have gone to the insurance companies and we're going to increase our taxes, and that's the way we're going to fund this. You're tripling what you're going to pay. And remember, that's still at a cost, an amount less than the cost for a lot of procedures, because doctors are required to take Medicare if they're doing certain things. So they're having to cut a price to the government so that they can continue to do business with the private sector. If you're taking away the private sector and mandating doctors only get paid what is less than the cost, that's a system set up for failure all the way around. It's a tilt. It's still a tilt. It tilts. And when I mean tilt, it bankrupts our country. It puts us out of business.
So that's why I think we need to have a whole episode, because we could spend hours talking about this. But just look at it two ways, just 2 quick points before we wrap up. One is, any country in the world that has a socialized system like this, they're not trying to change it because it works. It's not bankrupting them. They spend a lot, and I'm talking a lot less money per patient than we do here in the US. And here's why. In the US, what we're doing is we take Ken's paycheck and Jonathan's paycheck and Paco's paycheck, and we give it to a private insurance company, and then they negotiate with the hospitals and doctors, and then they decide how much pay. And just for doing that function, they also take a profit from that. Change that to where, instead of putting that money into the hands of a private insurance company, we put it into a social bucket where somebody, and number one, I wouldn't trust the government to do this, but we'll just say that they're doing it. We give this to the government to where they don't take a profit, but we're still putting Ken's paycheck, Jonathan's paycheck, Paco's paycheck into that bucket. We automatically start seeing the savings because nobody's taking profit, and doctors still get the same amount of money as they would if they were dealing with private insurance companies. And that's just the basic concept of it, but it's a very complicated thing that, again, unfortunately, because we have a lot of legalized corruption in the US, I would not trust the government to run it. effectively anyway.
All right. Well, I agree with you on that. And I think that's probably the best reason why you can't have Medicare for all. But I understand your argument. And that's an argument that we've heard for a long time. I wish there was, I mean, I think probably the answer to this is there's not an easy solution for a whole bunch of problems.
I agree.
And when both parties are ruling from the extremes, then we have a system set up where you have to have complete control of the Senate. You have to have 60 votes in the Senate, or you can't pass anything because you can't propose a moderate agenda. You can't propose a piecemeal of anything. You have to go for the whole thing from your party's extreme perspective. And so, thank goodness, if that's where we are, nothing's going to from either side for the foreseeable future until somebody wakes up and says, let's do something, let's propose a middle agenda. I don't know what the moderate solution for this is. I know that, Hillary proposed Hillary Care when Clinton was president, and that didn't go anywhere. Obamacare, only passed because of Pelosi, and only didn't get repealed only because of the Republican who passed away. I can't remember his name right offhand, because he was the one vote that voted against it when they had the votes to repeal it. He should have voted for it. I don't know. I don't think there's an easy solution here. And the problem is that both parties are not willing to work together. And until you tell both parties, we're not doing anything until y'all work together, then we're not going to do anything. But right now, if you tell the parties that, they think each side has a veto, and that's what they want. So we have a system set up for failure. I would argue the Senate has always been set up for that. That's the way it systemically has been set up. That's the reason why it was created, make it difficult to pass things. And that's not a bad thing. And we should celebrate that instead of demonize it more. But thanks for having me, guys. It's been a lot of fun.
No, thank you so much, Ken. Thanks, Jonathan.